In our first video, we defined working memory as the ability to keep information active in memory, to carry out some processing task, and to resist the distraction caused by that processing task. The first of these abilities depends on your capacity to remember information. How many items can you remember correctly and in the right order? Now we will explore this memory component of working memory. We call the number of items you can remember and immediately repeat in correct order your immediate memory span. This aspect of working memory is important while trying to remember a shopping list, for example.
In adults, we talk about the magical number 7. This was in fact the title of a paper by Miller in 1956, in which he estimates this to be the average memory span among adults. However, spans are lower in children and develop with age, and there is considerable variation among adults. Another key point to note is that it seems we have separate systems for remembering verbal information, numbers and words for example, and visual or spatial information. Some studies have imaged people's brains while they do verbal or visual or spatial memory span tasks, and have shown different brain regions are involved in each type of test. In our own research, we've shown that individuals with Down syndrome have particular problems on verbal span tasks, but have spatial spans that are in line with their other cognitive abilities. In comparison, individuals with the rarer condition, Williams syndrome, show the opposite pattern.
To properly measure someone's immediate memory span, we don't normally send them shopping with very long lists and see what they bring back. Rather, we give them assessments in which we ask them to remember an increasing number of items, starting with 1 item, moving on to 2 items and so on, and we find the point at which their memory starts to fail.
We call the maximum number of items that someone can remember correctly their span.
Educational psychologists might often use a digit span task as a simple way of measuring a child's storage capacity for verbal information. However, immediate memory spans for spatial information are less often assessed, but could be a source of strength or difficulty for a child. One way of assessing spatial span is with the Corsi block tapping task.
In this task, children see an array of blocks and need to copy the sequence tapped out by the psychologist. We would look for similarities and differences between their span on this task and their verbal memory span, to identify strengths and weaknesses in verbal or visuo-spatial short-term memory.
Within the classroom, students with verbal short-term memory deficits often forget instructions they've just been given. They'll drift off whilst they're sitting for an extended carpet session, and they're likely to be doing things more visually and kinesthetically, so drawing on a notepad or playing with their shoelaces rather than listening to what's going on around them. These children may also forget what it is they want to write or say back to someone, and it can be kind of appear that they put their hand up, want to answer a question, and then they say nothing as if they don't know the answer, but actually they've just forgotten what it was they wanted to say. We often assume that the visual methods are easier for children to recall because they link with previous learning and they generally stay in our mind for a little bit longer. However, for some children, using visual information is hard. It can be very distracting. There's lots of information to process, and actually by trying to process all of that information, it can be really distracting for them, especially if you're then asking them to recall what they could see. Therefore, it's really vital that we clarify what the needs are for our children in schools through proper assessments, and then we can support their learning appropriately.
Children with poor vocabulary development have often been found to have difficulties with verbal short-term memory tasks, and it may be that their short-term memory has not developed sufficiently to support their vocabulary learning. While this is a dramatic example of what can follow from verbal short-term memory difficulties, children who do not have poor vocabulary may also have short-term memory problems.
This may be seen in a difficulty following instructions or remembering the end of a sentence. They may lose their place in a complicated task and skip to the end after only completing the first stage. If visual short-term memory is poor, then they may have difficulties solving mathematical problems that involve visual memory, such as shape rotation, visual comparisons, or carrying operations. In both situations, children who are struggling with tasks because of the memory demands may become bored and restless or distressed, as they can't remember what to do next. They may appear as though they haven't listened to instructions. They may abandon the task altogether.
We need to support children who may have these memory difficulties. The key point to emphasise to teachers is to be aware of any memory load when giving children tasks or instructions. A set of 3 instructions is likely to be beyond the memory capacity of most 7-year-olds. But once a task is broken down into more manageable chunks, children may be able to complete it without difficulty. Offer short lists of instructions rather than one long list, and avoid overcomplicating material.
Researchers, Professor Sue Gathercole and Tracy Alloway, have suggested 3 ways that you can support children with limited verbal memory spans. Tell children that it is okay to ask for instructions to be repeated. If they can't remember something, they can ask the teacher, or, if appropriate, they can ask a friend. Repeat the important information. Encourage the use of visual aids where a verbal problem is encountered, and verbal aids where a visual problem is encountered. In both situations, children can benefit from having stages of a problem on flashcards or writing a list of instructions they can refer back to. The most desirable endpoint will be for a child to begin to use these strategies themselves to support their own learning.
Later on, in our 4th video, we'll talk in more depth about which strategies can be used to support learning.